I learned the Russian system of training from countless hours of reading, studying, and working with coaches such as Boris Sheiko, one of the most technical coaches in the sport. The Russian training system is a whole different animal. Today, I'll break down what makes it unique, how it's structured, and what you can take from it, even if you're not a world champion or Olympian. All right, let's break this down into three parts. First, the key features of the Russian training system. Second, what makes it different than the American system or the Bulgarian system? And then third, what can you take from this and apply to your own training systems? So the first thing is, what is the Russian training system? What are the key features of it? I would define this based on what I know from the Russian training system, or the most sort of prevalent information we have, which is based heavily on Medvedev's training methodology. And those are a high volume and structured training progression, so a phasic structure to the training with organized blocks and phases directed at a particular goal. The periodization is very straightforward, but it is phasic in nature. The second is the use of different types of loading structures or waves or blocks that have a distinct structure to them that is predetermined before it's built. And then the third is an emphasis on technical proficiency and sub-maximal training loads. So not a heavy emphasis on extremely high intensity weights or high intensity training sessions, but really a primary focus on the balance between high volume and technical mastery. What I would say are some of the key elements here of the Russian system that are really unique is that they, or Medvedev for sure, used a kind of patterned approach to their training system. So they would break down weeks into pre-planned amounts of training volume, breaking that into patterns that they discovered. So 35% of volume dedicated to one week, 28% to another, 22% to the final week, and then the deload or the last week would be 15%. So you're getting this kind of consistent training distribution of volume within a week, within a month, within different phases, and it's programmed from the top down. The Russian training system does apply all of the principles of training. So you have overload in adequate amounts, you have fatigue management in adequate amounts, you have adherence to the principle of SRA, you have a ton of variation in the system, you have phase potentiation, and then you have an application of individual differences as well. So the system does work well, it does apply all of these scientific principles, and it does a good job of executing all of them. The uniqueness of it being a very sub-maximal, high variation training system in my mind is what makes it kind of unique in the systems of training that you see around the world. Weightlifting is a strength sport, it's a power sport. You're oftentimes seeing programs that are very, very heavy or focusing on maximal lifts, whereas the Russian approach, or at least what we have been exposed to in the West, is a little bit different than that. It's much more sub-maximal, it's much more focused on the structure of the training and the application of these principles to achieve the adaptations they want, versus this idea of forcing adaptation through a pre-designated sort of progressive overload, if you will. I think that's the key difference, and the key thing that makes it so unique is that you get a lot of exposure to technical practice. So a ton of sub-maximal work, a lot of volume being dedicated to that work as well. You'll see a lot of athletes and a lot of programs being done with high rep sets. So snatches and clean and jerks in the many sets in the 2, 3, 4, even 5 rep range, where there might be a complex of 3 cleans plus 2 jerks, or multiple sets of 3 plus 3 plus 3 in a complex for snatch. It's a unique aspect of the Russian system in my mind, because I don't think you see that very often outside of that, especially as a sort of staple in the training program. This is one of the benefits, one of the features of the system, in that you can apply a lot of training load to somebody, so a ton of volume, a ton of technical practice to the exercises, and you can really develop excellent skills and excellent technique. In my experience training using the system for powerlifting, in my experience, I was doing a ton of training volume in the probably 70 to 85%, really more like 70 to 80% range. And every single repetition was always technically perfect, because you're never in a place where the execution of the lift is so taxing or so sort of high exertion that your technique breaks down. Technique applied there is going to transfer really well to the execution of maximal weights. In weightlifting, it's even more important to have a focus on technique work and the development of technical skills through the bulk of your training volume. If you have a system that is built around maximum attempts, heavy weights all the time, you'll develop more strength, but you won't necessarily have good technical skills. And what's gonna happen is that breakdown is gonna happen much lower in the intensity band. So you're gonna start to see more disjointed technique, less efficient technique, more kind of leaning on only one particularly athletic athlete that can execute the technique because everything is so broken and run down that they can't really do things perfectly. And then you're gonna end up with lifters that look, you could describe it as a bit more wonky, a little bit more, avant-garde maybe. You get just a different approach to it. The Russian system and the Russian athletes that were produced were oftentimes really technical, looked super, super flawless up until maximum weights. Then they would basically just not be able to lift the weight or miss really, really subtly. Whereas you see like in the Bulgarian system, athletes were kind of rugged from the start of the competition or the first lift they took. Might even look like they couldn't do any more, then they'd add more kilos, then add more kilos and make the lifts. And so I think that's a defining characteristic as well, is that you see Russian athletes, from that era looked technically flawless, incredibly strong, really, really great technicians, and executed super well in competition. And that's entirely a byproduct of the fact that they were training with lots of sub-maximal training volume and applying a system that really executed on the principles of training in its entirety rather than just one quality, like let's overload these athletes with a ton of intensity and just drive their strength levels up as high as we can and hope they make lifts. So real quick, if you're looking for a personalized adaptive weightlifting program that's made completely for you and adapts daily to your needs, check out Weightlifting AI. It is the only product of its kind. It has been battle tested by thousands of lifters who are hitting PRs every day, and you can try it for 2 weeks completely free by using the code 2weektrial at checkout. It's the first link in the description of this video. What makes it really kind of different, the Russian training system, different than, let's say, the American system? I think that's a tough question to answer because in the American system, for one, there isn't really a system. You have many different coaches that apply very different training methodologies to their athletes. But the thing I think that a lot of people get incorrect in the US is the principle of SRA, which is stimulus recovery adaptation. And that really states that you have to apply stimulus to an athlete in this case. They are going to have their current state of fitness disrupted. They're going to recover from that stimulus and then achieve a higher level of performance from that. So stimulus recovery adaptation. That should be the underlying principle that guides how you progress in training. When in this country or in the US, a lot of times you see people getting that backwards, which is the belief that the progression of load is what drives progress. Meaning, people think that if you do training and then the next week you add weight to the bar, that's what makes you stronger, and then you add weight and then you get stronger. And we know it's actually backwards. It's the other way around, is that you have to do training, then you get stronger, then you have to add more weight to the bar in order to stimulate yourself enough to get stronger again. And knowing that, you can then look at something like the Russian system and say, why is the progression not just every week you add 2 kilos or 5 kilos to the bar? And it's because if you apply a stimulus, you know that at the end of the application of that stimulus, there'll be a disruption of that state of the athlete, and then a recovery and an adaptation, and they'll be stronger. So you don't need this application of every week add weight to the bar. You can have periods that are a bit longer where there's a dedicated amount of training stimulus allocated to the athlete. They execute that, and then they'll recover, and they become stronger from that. So it's a little bit different application. It makes more sense when you consider that every period of training is designating a certain amount of training volume to somebody, a certain amount of training load to somebody, and then they get stronger from that, and then the next phase is harder, and they train that way and get stronger from that. Versus this sort of kind of linear approach, which is really common in the West, which is every week we add weight to the bar, and that's what's making you stronger. The problem with that method is when you add weight to the bar every time, you're not necessarily accurately assessing how much weight to add to the bar. If you say, hey, week 1 we did 100 kilos for 5, and then week 2 we're gonna do 105 for 5, that isn't necessarily the correct amount. It's not the right training stimulus. It might not be. It might be if you're lucky, but it could be too much, it could be too little, so you're not actually maximizing the amount of progress somebody can make in that case. If you were to stretch it out and be a little bit different about it and approach it from the perspective of SRA being applied, you would maybe train 100 kilos and do 5 reps. And then the next week you would come in and assess how ready is this athlete to do more, what should they be doing, and then you apply maybe 108 kilos or 103 kilos or whatever it is. You could stretch that time frame out over a week and make it into a month or an entire training block and say, here's the training we're gonna do. It's a varied amount of high variations as far as multiple different exercises, multiple different set and rep schemes, but of course, over the course of a month, they execute that training volume, and then the next month you have a higher intensity phase that they enter into, and they should be stronger. So they can now tolerate these higher loads and more specific training. So it's just a different approach in general to the way that training is done, but it's an application of the principles in a way that makes a little bit more sense. That's how I would look at it. That's kind of the easiest way to do it. And I glossed over a little bit there, but basically that's what we're looking at. Is it's not as linear as you would expect from what we see in the West. How it's different than the Bulgarian style of training is that my experience with the Bulgarians was very different than I think a lot of people experience it. People in the West use Bulgarian system, and they use the idea of going heavy often as a sort of panacea to say this is what the Bulgarians do. When the reality is the Bulgarian system was just, in my experience from Ivan Abadjiev, was just maximum weights all the time, every single day. To say that that's wrong is discounting the success they had. They've done phenomenally well in different periods of time. They have phenomenal lifters, but it isn't necessarily a system that really lends itself well to individualization. You're just applying the same training stimulus to everybody, and you're pushing everybody as hard as possible, and you're hoping that they rise to the occasion and they adapt and they get stronger. Those that don't really make it. That statement is true. I guess you could also say that's true of every system, that the people that can't get better don't keep going. The Bulgarian system is just a much more, I would say, blunt tool used to try and extract winners from a talent pool versus developing a training system that you take talented athletes and you develop them as much as you can based on the individual needs of those athletes. I would say the Russian system, in the spectrum of those 3 systems, does probably the best job of blending technical practice, training principles, and a strong overload stimulus into a good system where, in a lot of American systems, you see a bit more of a forced approach, where it's kind of this brute, we just keep building and adding, or they have more of a sort of rigid approach that's more simplified. Maybe an over-reliance on strength work and building up giant squat numbers or strength numbers. Maybe less of a focus on the technical aspects. The Bulgarian system, again, almost the opposite of that, which is this just aggressive driving forward of the classic exercises, pushing them as hard as possible, driving those numbers up as much as possible, similar to the American system in just like a brute force approach. Granted, there's a lot of hand waving here, and there's a lot of stereotyping different systems, which is everyone's favorite thing to do. But that's my take on what makes those very different. If you're an athlete or a coach who's looking at this and saying, well, obviously all the systems have produced really good lifters, and every system is really just something that is sort of a guideline that coaches have to execute on and apply to their athletes, how can you take something away from this as a coach or an athlete and use it in your own training? And I would say the sort of key things here that I would pull from the Russian style of training that I have not seen in the other systems well is the application of a lot of submaximal training. So spend a lot of your time as an athlete or a coach with your training load basically allocated to sort of that mid-range sort of 70 to 85% loading, and spend a lot of time on submaximal training to perfect technique. That should be the foundation and core of your training system. It should not be huge squat numbers. It should not be giant, heavy training sessions all the time. It shouldn't be this intent on constantly trying to overload the athlete every week, just adding weight to the bars. Think about it as accumulate a mass of training that is well balanced in the intensity ranges, that gives the athlete a lot of exposure to technical submaximal work so they can develop really, really good skills and perfect their technique without being in a place where they're just constantly trying to drive the number forward. The second thing I would say is keep track of really important metrics that you can relate to a consistent training load. So if we're training submaximally and we're using a system like this, we can then find KPIs or key performance indicators that really indicate whether we're getting better or not. If your system just revolves around maxing out all the time, your only metric for tracking whether you're getting better is how much weight did I lift, or if your system revolves around, say, adding weight to the bar every week and you don't add weight to the bar one week, you look at it as a failure, right? So I would say find metrics that are important. The three that I think are most valuable are tracking the total repetitions in a week, so you have a good understanding of how much volume you're doing or how much volume an athlete is tolerating. The second would be, what is the average weight lifted? In the research, in the literature you see in some of the Russian training, they correlated very highly the results of an athlete with the average weight of the barbell. And that makes sense. The strongest athletes are going to lift the heaviest weights most often, but tracking the average weight is really valuable because it gives you very clear insight into how much load the athlete is actually doing. If your average weight of the bar is increasing or decreasing or staying stable, you have an idea of what's happening with the overall stimulus. So we would look at this number over time and say, in this time frame, what was the average weight? It was, let's say, 100 kilograms. And then the next time frame, that average weight is climbing up slowly to 105 kilograms. We know that our overload stimulus, which is the second most important training principle after specificity, if that number is moving up, we're definitely getting stronger, right? So that's a really simple metric to track. And then the final one I would say is the peak intensity. What is the athlete's exposure to heavy lifts? Because we have to practice, heavy lifts, heavy, single repetition exercises in training so we can get good at it in competition. So those three factors really sort of sum up the overall training load, but what's important as far as tracking and what's important as far as delivering a good training stimulus to the athlete. And I would extract that before everything else from the training system, what you can apply. The second thing is obviously just prioritize, technical work, prioritize a use of a high degree of variation in training. So a large pool of exercises should be used because there's a lot of benefits to having many different variations that are similar to the exercise, but maybe exaggerate or implement a different technical skill that the athlete could benefit from when doing their own, their classic exercises. A good example of this would be some variation like, my favorite, like no hook, no feet snatches, where you're modifying an exercise just slightly, but what it does is exaggerate different components of the lift to improve the technique overall without making, the need for selecting a bunch of different movements to do that. You're not really in a place to have to cue really heavily or coach really heavily. This exercise itself does a lot of those things well. So I would say the use of more variety in training is going to benefit athletes in general because they're getting exposed to different aspects of the lift in different ways, and they benefit from that. We know that if you practice something like a free throw from one angle only, you're probably not going to be very good at it from other angles. But if you practice a free throw from all around the basket, and different conditions, you're going to be better at a free throw from directly in front, right? So we want to have some of that exposure to variation and variability in training that's subtle but vast, and it gives us the ability to improve our technical skills a lot. That coupled with submaximal training really produces very technically sharp athletes, in my opinion. Finally is the application of different training principles. So the application of SRA, or stimulus recovery adaptation, which I've talked about before in this video, but basically, are we applying training load in the right way? Are we looking at it from the perspective of growth of the stimulus across periods of time, with the athlete's readiness and their ability to train being the driver of that training load? Or are we looking at it from the other perspective, which is every week we just add to the overload mechanism, we add more volume, we add more intensity? We want to be in a place where we're matching the training stimulus to what the athlete. So that's basically the gist of what I would say is the difference between the Russian system, the American system, the Bulgarian system, how I would apply some of those principles, how I would extract value from that and apply it to my own training and to my athletes' training. And in my experience, it works very well if you take what works and apply it to your athletes in the correct dose and the correct time without being dogmatic about it. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel, and check out my next video where I break down the technique of some of the athletes using my weightlifting AI system, and I'll see you in the next one.